Bonjour. That's French for hello. Welcome to our second lecture dealing with French absolutism, the Enlightenment, and the Revolution. Today we're going to be talking about the Enlightenment and the Scientific Revolution. During this lecture we will look at some of the greatest scientists and philosophers, not only as proof of the basic showing us proof not only of the basic understanding of our solar system, but also creating new social ideas that would forever change the world that still affect us today. As usual, please make sure that you have your Lecture 2 worksheet available and ready to be filled out, and as always, feel free to pause and look back at the video if you feel you're missing anything or need some clarification. Now that that's all done, let's get going. So, setting the stage. Remember that the Renaissance and the Reformation were still going on during this time period. The Renaissance was a rebirth of learning and the arts inspired by a spirit of curiosity in many different fields. Scholars began to question the ideas that they had been accepted for hundreds of years, so they're checking new things out. And the Reformation prompted religious followers to challenge accepted ways of thinking about God and salvation. The last thing the church, both Catholic and Protestant churches, could afford was that people would be challenging the historical traditions and centuries-old beliefs. So let's get started looking at the Revolution in its early days. In the 1500s, scholars looked to ancient Rome or Greek texts or the Bible to determine what was true or false. After all, it was people like Aristotle that created the idea of studying philosophy and science. Anyone who would dare question the Greeks or the Romans, for example, for what the church and the governments idolized, this would cause trouble for the existing establishment, and those in power could not afford that kind of trouble. Many believed in the geocentric theory, which is the idea that the sun, the moon, and the planets revolve around the earth. Well, that was wrong. Ptolemy, some Greek guy, had said that God had made the earth the center of the universe. However, by the mid-1500s, the scientific revolution was in full swing. The scientific revolution was a new way of thinking about things in the natural world. The way that we spoke of is upon using careful observation to question accepted beliefs. The Renaissance and the Age of Exploration would also help lead to the scientific revolution in the discoveries that they made and the travels that these people went on and the discoveries they made in the different places they had been. Prior to the works of Kepler and Copernicus, it was believed that the Earth was the center of the universe. Everything revolved around the Earth. The reasoning behind this was that if God created Earth in His own image, He would have made the Earth the center of the universe as well. Well, with that being the accepted theory, of course the church would be concerned about those who teach new ideas that go against these teachings. The obvious concern being that if the church is questioned about science, what else could they be questioned about? What else should they be questioned about? Let's take a look at some of the scientific theories and discoveries that were made during the scientific revolution. First, let's start with Copernicus. He reasoned that the sun was the center of our solar system, and that led to his heliocentric theory. Helio meaning, or coming from Helios, who was the Greek sun god. Copernicus did not publish his findings until the year he died. Probably a smart idea, since it was a legitimate concern that scholars and clergy would reject his findings, which would get him into trouble with the church. Galileo, however, built the first telescope in 1609. He discovered Jupiter and its 4 moons, and that our own moon had a rough surface. Not bad for that time period. Until he had made one big mistake. As you might have guessed, Galileo, however, did not keep his findings to himself, and was later put on trial with the threat of torture from the Pope himself. Galileo had originally agreed to the findings that Copernicus had. However, he was later forced to admit they were false. He ended up living the rest of his life under house arrest. Copernicus, Kepler, and Galileo began using what was known as the scientific method, which simply put is just a logical procedure for gathering and testing new ideas. Isaac Newton would discover gravity and its laws of motion, or its laws that go along with gravity. He didn't discover it, he just realized it. That's a better way of putting it. And other impressive advances came along during the Revolution as well. Some of them are the first microscope, the first mercury barometer, a smallpox vaccine, and new advances in chemistry. For those of you that are interested, I would recommend reading Chapter 22, Section 2, that talks about the smallpox vaccine and how it was actually developed using what's known as bovine or cowpox, or bovine pox, on how they were able to use a type of smallpox that cows had, and it was used to actually cure the smallpox problem that was going on for humans. I thought it was pretty interesting. And here's an interesting likeness of Copernicus. Looks like the guy is hiding something, if you ask me. It's just those shifty eyes, I think. And of course, Galileo. One thing that I'm always curious about is why is it all the famous scientists and guys that we remember and see all have white beards? I don't know, just a random thought. Besides advancements in science, we also saw major advancements on how people were thinking, or at least how they thought about those who would lead them. People were looking at new aspects of society, its government, religion, economics, and education. This spurred an Enlightenment. It continued to bring with it an intellectual movement that stressed reason and thought, and the power for the individual to solve their own problems. Among those new thinkers was Thomas Hobbes, who we see here. He kind of is a depressing look at government, as we'll see in a second here. Thomas Hobbes had a different view of how the government should be ran. He believed that all humans are naturally selfish and wicked and need a strong ruler to govern over them. He came up with this idea that we call a social contract, which simply put is where the people have agreed to give total control to a monarch that will act in their own self-interest and not on the interests of the individual themselves. So he's looking at the self-interests of, or not the interests of the whole country and the whole state, not the individual, since the individual can't be trusted, according to his theory. On the other hand, we have John Locke right here, who is probably the most influential and scandalous for his ideas on government. But I'll give you a hint on what it was. Our Constitution was based off of it. Here we see actor Terry O'Quinn, who is a character who plays the character John Locke, for which he won an Emmy, in the TV series Lost several years ago. For your information, the character John Locke, played by Terry O'Quinn, has nothing to do with the real life John Locke. Just the same name, for those of you that might have watched the show. Okay, back to the real John Locke and his views on government. Locke had a more positive view on people than Hobbes did. He felt that people could learn from their experiences and improve upon them themselves. He felt that all people were born free and equal with three natural rights: life, liberty, and property. I bet if you look in the Declaration of Independence, you'll see those three items. Think about that. According to Locke, the government is to protect these rights, and if they fail to do so, the citizens have the right to overthrow it, or the government. Locke basically is saying that if you're pissed off at the government, you should rebel against it. That certainly had come to some people's attention. Say the king, perhaps? The last thing he needs are the people rebelling against him if they're pissed off at him. Wait, that happened. Actually, it happened twice. One of them we're kind of talking about now a little bit. Keep that in mind. Besides political authors, we also had what are known as philosophies that try to advocate reason. The idea that common sense things that all people should be able to figure out and get behind is what we should be looking at, not just what the authorities tell us. These people that looked at reason and simple common sense were known as social critics. They hung around France during the 1700s and were more appropriately called philosophies. It was plural for what we call philosophers today. They just called them philosophies back then. There was a core theme that these philosophies had believed in: reason, nature, happiness, progress, and liberty. Among these philosophies, Voltaire was probably the most brilliant and influential of them. He used satire against the clergy, aristocracy, and government, basically making fun of them. Pretty dangerous of him to do so, though, because you don't want to tick off the people in power. Even though he did make many enemies, Voltaire never stopped fighting for tolerance, religion, and freedom of speech. Another one of these philosophies was Montesquieu, who believed that Britain was the best governed body in the world. This would later help influence the creation of a two-house system of government in the United States. Britain had, for example, the House of Lords and the House of Commons. The United States created the Senate and the House of Representatives, taking a portion of Britain's fairly successful model and making it their own, basically using what Montesquieu believed as a continuation of what Britain's already been doing. Montesquieu liked the idea of a two-house system. There was also Rousseau, who was passionately committed to individual freedoms. Beccaria was interested in the justice system and how the laws existed to preserve social order, not to avenge crimes or simply punish the guilty. The idea being that people need to be punished not for them to, or not for the purpose of being punished, but to basically prevent somebody else from doing the same thing. And finally, we can look at Mary Wollstonecraft, who argued that women's education should not be secondary to that of a man's, and that a woman needs to educate, or to be educated, to become more virtuous and useful. The idea, if we're going through this new revolution, this new idea of enlightenment, that women should be enlightened as well. That a person should be smart, or a man should be smart in the woman he marries. She should be smart, intellectual, witty, virtuous, things like that. That is the ideas that made for an attractive woman, according to Mary Wollstonecraft. And as a result of the Enlightenment, we see the writers challenged long-held beliefs and ideas about society. They challenged the church, state, monarchs, and unequal social classes. These ideas would spread and ultimately help start two of the most influential events in world history: the American and the French Revolutions.